Today, we're looking into a mind that built an elaborate, private world of profound darkness, a world fueled by the ultimate act of psychological detachment. We're not just going to review the facts of the Jeffery Dahmer case. We're going to answer the question that obsessed his own father. How does a person become a monster? As a licensed professional counselor, I can tell you that the difference between an everyday troubled person and a serial killer is often found in the pathology of their attachment, or the complete lack thereof. Traits that allowed him to view human beings as objects, not people. You'll get the full, exclusive clinical breakdown toward the end. Don't miss the only part of the story that you haven't heard yet about Jeffery Dahmer. Welcome. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I talk about the psychology behind the crimes. Today, we're analyzing a case that remains a horrifying study in isolation, control, and a complete collapse of human empathy. Without further ado, let's pull back the curtains and unravel the dark psychology at the heart of this case together. This is the story of Jeffery Dahmer. The most essential question in this case is not what he did, but why he started. The earliest, most concerning psychological clues about Jeffery Dahmer can be found decades before his capture, long before any crime was committed. He was born in 1960 to a turbulent home environment, one defined by the constant, overwhelming emotional instability of his parents, Lionel and Joyce. His father, Lionel, was a distant, often absent chemistry student, obsessed with his work and rarely present for emotional connection with his son. His mother, Joyce, struggled with severe mental health issues, including anxiety and depression, and her emotional volatility made the home an unpredictable and often hostile place. Jeffery later described his early years as unremarkable, a facade of normalcy that hid a massive internal void and a profound sense of psychological abandonment. This environment created a textbook psychological precursor. A detached child in a chaotic home learns to rely only on himself, substituting genuine human connection with solitary, rigid obsessions. By age 10, this detachment manifested in a very disturbing way, an intense secretive fascination with dead animals. He would find roadkill, small creatures like dogs or squirrels, and carry them home to dissect, dissolving them in acid and meticulously preserving the skeletons. This wasn't simple curiosity. It was a deeply secretive, controlling ritual, and it was the first clue to his impending psychological break. This ritualistic control over death overshadowed his later, much more horrific attempts to control life and permanence itself. His father, Lionel, eventually noticed a strange hobby, but he didn't stop it. In fact, he encouraged Jeffery to continue his obsession. While his father's intent may have been bonding, this action unwittingly validated Jeffery's unusual and morbid fixation. But despite this strange shared interest, Jeffery remained intensely isolated, a psychological island drifting away from all moorings. As he entered high school, Jeffery Dahmer was already showing significant schizoid personality disorder traits. He was pathologically shy, aloof, had few friends, and appeared completely indifferent to praise or criticism of others. The defining feature of his personality structure is a pervasive pattern of detachment from social relationships and a restricted range of emotional expression. Dahmer wasn't just quiet. He seemed to exist behind a thick pane of glass, observing the world but never truly joining it, a key red flag to severe emotional blunting. His parents' agonizing, drawn-out divorce during this period became the final nail in the coffin of his emotional development. The sheer overwhelming chaos of the breakup, combined with his mother moving away and his father being consumed by work, created a vacuum of adult supervision. Left alone to his own devices in a house at age 18, Jeffery was psychologically unmoored, and this period with isolation marks the transition from morbid fantasy to destructive action. What happens when a deeply detached person already obsessed with death and control is given absolute unsupervised freedom for the first time? The first victim was a young hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. The murder committed the summer after his high school graduation in 1978 was not a premeditated and a complex way his later crimes would be. It was an impulsive release valve for years of building psychological tension. The choice of a hitchhiker highlights the convenience and the underlying desire for a victim who was already, psychologically speaking, detached from their usual social context. Dahmer drove the young man back to his empty house. His parents weren't there. He was by himself. The house that was symbolized as abandonment and isolation. The fact that the entire murder, disposal, and cleanup was executed by a solitary, inexperienced 18-year-old in his childhood home speaks volumes about his profound psychological isolation and the total lack of accountability he felt. Afterward, Dahmer's primary emotion wasn't guilt or panic, but a sense of relief, a fleeting clinical satisfaction that momentarily filled the deep emotional void. This single act cemented the pattern. Violence became his distorted temporary solution for his crushing isolation. Following the first murder, Dahmer made several attempts to force a sense of normalcy, but his underlying psychological pathology acted like an anchor, dragging him back down. He briefly joined the army, which failed due to his chronic, debilitating alcoholism, an addiction that acted as a chemical attempt to quiet his internal emotional deadness. The pervasive daily use of alcohol was a mechanism to blunt what little anxiety or moral discomfort he felt, allowing his dark fantasies to move closer to the surface. This pattern of failed structure and increasing substance abuse is crucial for understanding the escalation of his anti-personality disorder traits. While he never exhibited the grandiosity of classic narcissists, the core belief that rules don't apply to him and that others exist purely for his gratification is a hallmark of antisocial pathology. Dahmer was given a second chance after his discharge, living with his father in Akron, Ohio, and later with his grandmother. These periods of living under supervision provided temporary stability, but the fantasies were always there, evolving, waiting for the psychological opportunity to resurface. In 1987, Jeffrey moved into his own apartment in Milwaukee. The return to an independent, unsupervised living in an anonymous large city was a psychological green light for the full-blown emergence of its destructive fantasy life. The frequency of the crimes dramatically increased, and critically, the nature of the crimes changed. His primary motivation was no longer just the act of killing, but the chilling desire to create a permanent, controllable companion. He wanted to stop his victims from leaving him, reflecting a perverse and extreme manifestation of separation anxiety filtered through a lens of profound emotional objectification. The crimes were no longer about satisfying a violent urge. They were a desperate, flawed, and terrifying attempt to fix his internal psychological chaos by external means. As the body count rose, the clues began to pile up. Clues that were often dismissed because they didn't fit the expected profile of a killer in the low-income urban area. Neighbors complained relentlessly about the smell coming from his apartment, a smell that Dahmer calmly explained away as bad meat, or a malfunctioning freezer, or simply from his own mess. This ability to lie effortlessly, maintain a pleasant facade, and deflect suspicion in the face of overwhelming evidence is a classic psychological trait of a high-functioning individual with antisocial personality disorder. His most chilling close call before the final capture involved a man in 1991. Two police officers, Joseph Gaberish and John Belzec, were called to the scene outside his apartment where they found a terrified, naked, and visibly drugged 14-year-old boy. Dahmer, relying on this polite, clean-cut, white male persona, convinced the officers that the suspicion was simply a lover's quarrel between two adults and that the boy was his 19-year-old boyfriend. The officers, failing to correctly assess the obvious signs of trauma and distress, actually helped the young man back into the apartment and allowed Dahmer to close the door. This moment highlights a crucial psychological blind spot in society, the failure to believe that the true evil could be wrapped in such an ordinary, non-threatening package. The victims, predominantly young men of color, were chosen because Dahmer perceived them as being socially marginalized, further exploiting their vulnerability and increasing his sense of psychological control and impunity. The end came not through the meticulous work of the police, but through a terrifying, desperate act of survival by his final target, Tracy Edwards, on July 22, 1991. Edwards was brought back to the apartment, where he was subjected to Dahmer's ritual of force viewing of horror films and psychological manipulation. Dahmer presented a terrifying casual demeanor, but his inner world was fracturing. He told Edwards, "I'm going to have to kill you." It was a statement of psychological fact for Dahmer, a non-negotiable step in his dark ritual. But Edwards, a man whose quick thinking and survival instinct were paramount, did not freeze. He managed to leverage Dahmer's momentary distraction and delivered a kick that allowed him to escape the apartment and flag down 2 police officers. When the officers entered the apartment, they were initially looking for a weapon, but what they found was the ultimate inescapable clue. They found a Polaroid photo, a photo that was not just evidence of a crime, but a horrifying photograph of Dahmer's entire secret psychological world. The moment an officer lifted the cover of his bedside drawer and found the stack of images of his victims at every stage of his ritual, the psychological barrier between Jeffrey Dahmer and the rest of the world dissolved. He could no longer pretend. The subsequent search revealed the full, agonizing extent of his pathology. Human remains in his refrigerator, freezer, and bedroom, meticulously preserved and stored. This wasn't just murder. This was a chilling, protracted exercise in human objectification. We have the facts of the Jeffrey Dahmer case, but now let's pull back the clinical lens and understand the true psychological failure that led to this atrocity. Now let's get to the clinical deep dive of Jeffrey Dahmer's pathology. When we look at Jeffrey Dahmer, we are not looking at a simple diagnosis. We are looking at a catastrophic confluence of 3 distinct interacting psychological conditions. My clinical speculations are based on the extensive psychological evaluations performed on Dahmer during this trial. It's important to remember that this is not a personal diagnosis, but an analysis based on recorded behavior. First, the core foundation of his behavior is consistent with severe traits of antisocial personality disorder, often overlapping with the concept of psychopathy. This is characterized by a pervasive disregard and violation of the rights of others, a complete lack of empathy, and a failure to conform to legal and moral norms. Dahmer did not feel guilt. He felt inconvenience when his victims were discovered. Second, the structural mechanism of his detachment points strongly towards schizoid personality disorder traits. This explains the profound lifelong isolation, the emotional coldness, and the lack of desire for close relationships. He wasn't fighting the world. He was fundamentally indifferent to it, a trait that provided the necessary emotional insulation to carry out his horrific acts without suffering typical human remorse. The third and most unique component was his specific paraphilia, necrophilia, and its associated desire for control over non-responsive bodies. This desire was not simply sexual. It was a psychological need to possess and to manipulate, which evolved from his childhood fascination with dead animals. His fantasies, he told interviewers later, were about having a companion that would never leave him, a permanent, fully controllable object. This leads us to the critical cognitive distortion, objectification. Dahmer's victims were not people in his mind. They were psychological props to be used and consumed, stripped entirely of their personhood and their emotional weight. This is the psychological difference. A person with ASPD might kill for power or money, but Dahmer killed to achieve ontological possession, to make the victim his forever object. But we must clarify one important point here. Dahmer was not diagnosed with schizophrenia or dissociative identity disorder. Schizophrenia involves a break from reality, often auditory or visual hallucinations and disorganized thinking, none of which Dahmer displayed in a clinical sense. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he understood that it was wrong. His acts were calculated, methodical, and entirely rooted in his own conscious, twisted desires, not in a loss of touch with reality. The psychological pathology of the perpetrator is only half the story. We must also examine the psychological context of the victims and the trauma inflicted. Dahmer deliberately targeted individuals who he believed were marginalized, making them psychologically and socially vulnerable. His victims were often young men he met in bars or on the street, many of them belonging to communities that police and society were less likely to scrutinize aggressively. This calculated selection created an environment where their disappearances went unnoticed for months, compounding his sense of psychological immunity. For the victims who were coerced in his apartment, the psychological trauma began with the realization of his betrayal. They were in this presence of someone who presented as friendly, lonely, or harmless, only to find themselves trapped in a terrifying scenario of manipulation and control. This transition from trust to betrayal is a profound psychological injury, a form of grooming, designated to disarm the victim's survival instincts. The fact that so many were drugged or incapacitated was not just a means of control. It was a way for Dahmer to bypass the psychological discomfort of struggling with a person who was consciously resisting him. In his mind, an incapacitated person was already halfway to being the compliant, controllable object that he craved. The victims' families, in the wake of the discovery, were left with the unimaginable psychological burden of knowing their loved ones were subjected to such profound cruelty. Their grief was not just about loss. It was about the horrific violation of their loved ones. The arrest of Jeffrey Dahmer on that summer night in 1991 brought an abrupt, shocking end to a 13-year reign of terror. The jury rejected the plea of guilty by reason of insanity, finding him legally sane and responsible for his actions, a verdict based on the fact that he understood the nature and wrongfulness of his crimes, despite his severe psychological deviations. Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, bringing a measure of legal, though not emotional, closure to the victims' families. The Dahmer case is a necessary, painful study of how profound psychological trauma and detachment, when combined with antisocial traits and the development of specific paraphilias, can create a person devoid of moral core. While the criminal justice system delivered its judgment, the psychological community continues to study his case as a textbook example of extreme emotional blunting, a mind so isolated it turned its internal chaos into a methodical, externalized nightmare. What did you think about this case? You probably heard of Jeffrey Dahmer, but did you know the full extent of what he did? If you thought this psychological analysis of Jeffrey Dahmer was interesting, take a look at my next video. You're going to find another serial killer that I explore the psychology and his reasons and motive of why he committed the crimes. Thank you for watching. And until next time, stay curious, stay safe.